The first lash did not sound like punishment. It sounded like thunder cracking open a dawn too fragile to hold its own silence. The soldiers stood in rows, eyes sharp, boots lined like teeth, yet not one of them breathed easy. Blood was already streaking down Thomas Brennan's back, turning his shirt into a canvas of pain, and still he would not break. His teeth pressed hard into leather, his hands bound raw against the post, his head lifting not in pride, but in defiance of despair. He had chosen this, though not for glory, not for rebellion, not even for survival. He had chosen it because 3 nights ago, under a thin moon and a hush broken only by drunken laughter, he had seen her, Ayanna, a girl who should have been safe, whose only crime was trying to trade beads for flour, caught in the fists of men who wore uniforms like his. In that single breath of cruelty, Thomas had moved, not with thought, but with a heart that knew the cost before the mind could name it. His fists had struck, his body had shielded, and now his flesh bore the price. Every crack of the whip was meant to teach him shame, but each cut carved something else instead. Remembrance. The memory of Ayanna's eyes wide with fear, then softened with relief as she clutched the bird she had pressed into his palm, as if a carving of wood could carry gratitude larger than words. The bird lay now in his cell, a fragment of her spirit that had become his talisman against the dark. Even as the lashes multiplied, he could still feel the shape of it against his skin, warming him more than the fire of blood could ever burn. He thought of her hands, trembling but brave, pressing cloth to the cut on his brow after the fight, her whisper in a language he did not know yet felt inside his bones. A whisper that had wrapped around his heart like healing light. The men watching saw a soldier punished. He saw instead a thread being spun, fine and unbreakable, stretching from his wounded body to her quiet strength. With each lash, he repeated the truth inside himself. It was worth it. Every stripe of pain was worth her safety, worth her dignity, worth the way her presence had turned a night of cruelty into the beginning of something sacred. And though his knees shook, though his vision blurred, though blood ran like rivers down his spine, he stood in silence, not to prove himself to them, but to keep the promise he had made in the instant his body had moved to protect her, that her life would not be marked by shame while he had breath to stop it. The camp held its tension like a drum stretched too tight. Colonel Harrison's jaw was set in lines of discipline, but his eyes betrayed something else, an unease he could not voice. The men shuffled in their boots, some averting their gaze, others watching with the unease of those who know they are witnesses to something larger than orders. Beyond the gates, hooves stirred the earth, a sound that carried with it a strange gravity, as if destiny itself were riding nearer. Thomas swayed against the ropes, the world narrowing to Ayanna's face in his memory, to the bells that might one day sing at her throat, to the hope that what he carried in his scars would mean more than broken flesh. The whip paused. The silence that followed was sharper than the strike itself. And then the sound of riders filled the air, steady and unhurried, echoing against the wooden walls like a prophecy. The soldiers stiffened, weapons twitched in hands, but the colonel raised a hand, halting them. Dust lifted where the road curved, and 3 riders emerged, 2 warriors and 1 elder, whose presence seemed carved of mountain stone and endless sky. The air shifted. The lashes had not broken Thomas, but what came now would break the world open in ways none of them could predict. Love and suffering had already met in the scars across his back. Now they would be tested in the presence of a father, a chief, a man carrying his daughter's trust like fire in his chest. And in that moment, as the earth trembled with hooves and the sun burned low in the sky, Thomas Brennan realized his story was no longer his alone. It belonged to her, to the people who had come, and to a future that might yet heal if hearts chose courage over hatred. And if you feel your own heart moving with this story, if you hear in it a whisper of tenderness stronger than cruelty, let it live on. Press like, leave a comment with what touched you, and subscribe so you don't lose the next chapter of love's quiet defiance. Your voice, your presence, keeps the fire burning. The hush of dawn clung to the earth like a fragile veil, carrying with it the scent of dust, iron, and something unspoken that hovered between despair and hope. Thomas Brennan's body bore the evidence of his choice, 30 lashes carved into flesh that trembled with every shallow breath. Yet beyond the agony, beyond the rope-burned wrists and the sting of blood drying into his uniform, his heart clung stubbornly to one memory: the wide, terrified eyes of Ayanna, the Lakota girl who had appeared like a vision in the midst of cruelty. He remembered the exact way her hands had trembled when she pressed that small carved bird into his palm, a gift born not of tradition, but of silent gratitude. That bird, so simple and fragile, became more than a token. It was the thread stitching his shattered body back together, the whisper reminding him that pain had meaning when it was carried for love. And in the stillness of the morning, as the compound stirred restlessly, he knew that no amount of punishment could tear away the quiet healing he found in that fleeting connection. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of lashes blur into the rhythm of memory. Ayanna's face lingered, not as the frightened girl who had cowered beneath rough hands, but as a beacon, a reminder that gentleness could exist even within a world scarred by hatred. Her presence was like a balm, a healing touch that soothed wounds unseen, and he found himself clinging to the thought that she was out there somewhere, watching the same sun rise over the horizon. What hurt most was not the lashes, but the ache of not knowing if he would see her again. In that ache, something powerful took root, not despair, but longing, the kind of longing that reshapes a man's soul. The soldiers who surrounded him whispered of disgrace, of betrayal, of punishment for standing against his own kind. Yet Thomas felt no shame. Instead, he carried the weight of his decision with a strange pride because he had defended something pure, and in defending Ayanna, he had discovered a piece of himself he never knew existed, a part of his heart that chose love over duty, compassion over cruelty. It was a truth as painful as it was liberating, and it wrapped around him like the warm breath of healing air, reminding him that sometimes scars were not marks of defeat, but of choices that could not be unmade. Every drop of blood that fell to the earth seemed to echo with her name. Each cut whispered of the night he had seen her, fragile yet unbroken, her spirit like a flame refusing to yield to the storm. And in those moments of excruciating silence, he understood something deeper than duty or survival. Ayanna was not merely a passing shadow in his story. She was the story itself, the thread pulling him away from darkness toward a world he could scarcely imagine. Her existence reminded him that tenderness could be stronger than steel, that healing could spring from brokenness, that even enemies could be bound by the language of the heart. The men watching could not understand it. To them, he was a fool suffering needlessly. But Thomas carried inside him a secret stronger than their jeers, the memory of her touch, the faith that somewhere beyond walls and punishment posts, she was thinking of him too. That thought softened the agony, transformed each lash into something he could endure because it meant his suffering had not been in vain. He believed, against all reason, that love had already begun to take root in those 3 fleeting minutes, and that love, like a seed planted in hostile soil, would one day bloom. The compound shifted as shadows lengthened and the air thickened with expectancy. Soldiers fidgeted, officers muttered, and the world seemed suspended on a knife's edge between hate and understanding. Thomas hung silently, his strength waning, yet his spirit burning quietly in defiance of despair. And in that fragile silence, as his body swayed and his blood painted the earth, a presence stirred beyond the gates. Hoofbeats broke the stillness, steady and certain, heralding not more punishment, but the arrival of something that would change everything. The riders approached with solemn grace, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Healing and destruction, love and war, possibility and peril, all were braided together in that moment. And as Thomas lifted his head, straining to see through the haze of pain, he realized that his choice had set into motion a story far larger than himself, a story where Ayana's eyes and her father's presence would converge to challenge not only his fate, but the boundaries of 2 worlds that had never dared to dream of peace. The hoofbeats came first, slow, deliberate, echoing through the brittle morning air as if each step negotiated with history itself. The fort, a body of tense wood and iron, straightened at the sound. Hands shifted on rifle stocks, breath held. Dust lifted from the road in pale ribbons, like smoke from prayer fires, and the gates parted to welcome a small procession that wore the sky with the same ease one wears a memory. At its center rode an older man with hair silvered by sun and seasons. He sat a horse the color of riverbed clay, posture unbent, his gaze steady and fathomless. 2 warriors flanked him, not an army, not a threat, simply gravity given shape. He carried no banner, no white cloth, no letter with seal, yet the space around him felt ceremonial, the hush of a sanctuary, the kind of quiet that asks men to become better than their fear. Thomas lifted his head with effort, and the compound returned to focus. The ropes bite in his wrists, the wet warmth along his spine, the world haloed in light and pain. He breathed carefully as the riders reached the yard's hard-packed center. The old man dismounted without sound, palm to the horse's neck in a gesture that Thomas understood even from a distance. Gratitude. Love. In the small, steady ways that make a life. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, hat tucked in at his side, a soldier's respect, imperfect but sincere. He kept distance appropriate to caution and proximity appropriate to courage. The older rider walked to meet him, every movement precise and unhurried, like a prayer made with hands instead of words. "I am Iron Bear," the man said, his voice the low music of wind through tall grass. His English held careful edges, as if each word were carved and polished. "My daughter spoke of a man who chose pain instead of silence. I have come to look at such a man." The sentence hung there, simple and sudden, a bridge thrown across a canyon. Harrison's eyes flickered to Thomas, then back. "This is a military matter," he answered, but without iron in it. 30 lashes for striking a superior officer. Iron Bear considered this, not the way a man weighs a law, but the way he weighs a life. He turned, and his gaze found Thomas. Really found him. Saw him bound but unbroken, a body injured, yet a spirit still upright. There was no pity in that gaze, only the deep dignity of recognition. It was like being seen by a vast night sky, judged by nothing except the honesty of your own light. Thomas drew air into his chest. The old man's presence seemed to slow the burn that had been eating through him from the inside. For a moment his pain didn't vanish. Pain rarely gives you that mercy, but it softened, like a tide ebbing just enough for you to stand. The memory of Ayana's eyes moved in the space between them, a quiet breath, a whisper of gratitude carried across distance. 6 remain, said Iron Bear at last, as if he had counted not in numbers, but in storms. I ask that you pause your winds and give the earth this day to listen. Harrison's jaw tightened. Around them the men shifted, boots scuffing, hearts clanking like old armor. But the colonel's look wasn't hard, so much as it was weary with the burden of lines drawn by others and handed to him as orders. My duty is to finish what we begin, he said. Even then, his voice faltered on the word finish, catching on the thought that some endings destroy more than they complete. Iron Bear nodded. Patience radiated from him like heat from sun-warmed rock. He did not press. He invited. A man who carries pain for a woman's safety has already finished something, he said quietly. Perhaps this day is for beginning. The words slipped into the compound's timbered bones and stayed there, not an argument, a seed. The warriors on either side of Iron Bear remained very still. One bore the unreadable face of a man who has survived enough to become both steel and gentleness. The other, younger, watched the soldier's hands the way a wolf reads a winter sky. They wore their caution as they wore their knives, with care. But in the lines of their shoulders, Thomas sensed an unexpected peace. The small surrender people make when they decide to show up without their whole thunder. The wind shifted. Somewhere beyond the far wall, a crow argued with morning. Harrison seemed to age and soften in one exhale. He lifted his gaze to Thomas, then lowered it, as if what he saw was too human to stare at too long, the way a man looks at a wound or a miracle. Finally he said, "Very well. Until first light tomorrow, no more lashes." He didn't know he had offered a mercy. Only afterward did his posture reveal that he recognized the size of it. The fort breathed out. Even the dust sank back to earth. Iron Bear inclined his head in thanks without a victory in it. He drew nearer to Thomas, slow enough that each step asked permission. When he stood within arm's reach, he was careful not to touch. "My daughter," he said softly, and Thomas felt the air change with the sacredness of a name. "Told me your hands were careful, that your eyes were the ones that did not hate." Something fragile and luminous unfolded inside Thomas. He swallowed against the dryness in his throat. "Ayana," he managed, and in the way he spoke, her name was a prayer, a vow, and a question that wanted to become a future. Iron Bear's face altered by a degree mysterious but clear, a father hearing the tone that tells him far more than words. He reached into a beaded pouch and drew out a small bundle wrapped in soft hide, With a reverence that did not announce itself, he unwrapped it to reveal a carved bird threaded with a new string of blue and white beads. It caught the sun, turned it into quiet music. "She made this," he said, "but she feared a gift would be punished too." He glanced, only once, at Thomas's back, and then looked away, granting privacy to pain. "I brought it so she could breathe easier. It belongs to the man who stood in the doorway between harm and her life." The carved bird trembled in the light. Memory rose like a gentle tide inside Thomas, the silk of Ayana's small hands pressing the wood into his palm, the sound of shame breaking and healing in the same breath, the stranger's courage every love requires. He could not hold out his hands to take the gift. The rope denied that kindness. But he cradled it in his eyes and made a promise without speaking. "I will wear what your hands have made. I will become a man who makes beauty a shelter." Iron Bear lifted the necklace and placed it gently at Thomas's chest, letting the beads fall across torn cloth, a river of sky over a field of scars. The coolness of it shocked the heat, and somewhere in the ganglion of sensation, another kind of feeling ignited, a tender warmth that belonged to forgiveness and to the possibility of belonging. Around them, men noticed and did not understand, and that not understanding made their fingers itch for the familiar weight of weapons. But the hush held. A breeze sighed through the yard, cleansing in its passage, and the colonel's face bent not to fear but to thought. He was mapping what he was seeing against maps he had been given, borders, routes, rules. None of those maps had room for this. He seemed to sense, as the old chief did, that everything true begins as something for which we have no language. The younger warrior's head tilted, attention snagging on the gate. From far off came the quick rattle of more hooves, US and cavalry, by the sound of it, a cadence that belonged to urgency. Men stiffened. The spell of gentleness trembled. A patrol burst in under the guard's shout, horses wet with their own breath. The lieutenant dismounted in a rush that lacked grace, but held loyalty to a greater fear. He spoke low to Harrison, and yet the words were heavy enough to carry. Attacks to the south, wagon fires, dead families, a governor's fury already hitching itself to the nearest target. Thomas felt the fort tilt toward the old gravity of war. Iron Bear's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with the sorrow of someone who has lived long enough to recognize a story's shape before the first chapter ends. The lieutenant's message thickened the air, folding threat over this bright, fragile thing like a shadow crossing wildflowers. "There are those," Iron Bear said into the new, tense silence, "who wear other men's skins when they burn the world. Some do this for profit, some for sport, some for the pale comfort of simple blame. The wind tells me these fires may not be ours." He did not plead. He offered a truth the way one offers water. No guarantee it will be believed, but a duty to pour. Harrison's mouth set. He was a man built in the bone for following the line, but he also had the rare muscle memory of doing the right thing when the line ran crooked. He hesitated, warring with a system inside that startled at any invitation to nuance. "We ride at first light," he said finally to his lieutenant, then turned to Iron Bear. "The day stands as I promised." It was not enough to stop the storm, but it was an umbrella made of a man's word, and sometimes that is the only shelter we have. The two warriors exchanged a glance. The older one's face softened in faint relief. The younger's hand slipped from his knife hilt to a more comfortable rest. Thomas felt the thread hold. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat and let gratitude move through him like warm rain. When he opened them, Iron Bear was closer. The old man studied Thomas with a care that felt like a blessing. "I have seen many wounds," he said gently, "bison's horn, winter ice, sorrow. But there is one wound you carry that is not in your back. It is the part of a man that breaks when he chooses and is punished for it." Thomas swallowed. There it was, named without violence. "My daughter," Iron Bear continued. And that phrasing itself was medicine, the way he placed her in the center as a sacred being and not a prize. Has a heart taught to sing in times when most would go silent. She asks questions about the man whose hands knew how not to harm. She asks if such a man can live in a place where his choice is not called a crime. Something loosened in Thomas's chest. He felt breath arrive farther down than it had in hours, the lungs remembering how to unfurl. In that moment he didn't wonder what life would require of him. He only knew that if Ayana's questions were the air of another world, he wanted to learn how to breathe there. "I cannot ask you to break your laws," Iron Bear said to Harrison, shifting his gaze with courtesy that did not waver. "But I can ask you to open your hand." Harrison's reply came from a place he rarely accessed in uniform. "If there is a bridge that can be built with honor," he said, the words careful as stones placed in a river, "I won't be the one to burn it before it's walked." A murmur moved through the fort. Confusion, reluctance, something like respect. Iron Bear bowed his head once, as if honoring a fragile pact with the day itself. Then he did the quietest, bravest thing a man can do in a yard full of strangers. He smiled. It wasn't wide. It wasn't triumphant. It was the small, warm smile of a father who has glimpsed a door opening in a wall. He turned to Thomas again, and his voice lowered to the intimacy of truth. "You look like a man who belongs to two fires," he said, "the one that destroys and the one that warms. If you choose the second—" He let the sentence rest, neither promise nor threat, only an invitation. Thomas thought of the carved bird and the beads cool against his chest. He thought of Ayana's hands shaping them, of prayers spoken in the careful counting of blue and white, of time stitched into beauty. He thought of the 3 minutes that had stretched into a lifetime, how a choice made without calculation becomes a compass that does not lie. A cloud crossed the sun and then moved on. The yard brightened again, as if the sky had decided to agree with mercy. Somewhere beyond the walls a child laughed, clear sound, quick as a fish in clear water. Men looked up in spite of themselves, startled by the reminder that life insists on being beautiful even near blood. Iron Bear drew a leather-wrapped bundle from his pouch, tied with sinew and decorated with small shells that clicked softly like rain on river rock. He unbound it and revealed a pipe carved of red stone, the stem polished by generations of hands. The soldiers nearest them shifted, posture pricked with superstition and curiosity, but none moved to stop him. Even Harrison watched with an old-world respect, the kind we reserve for rights that don't belong to us but live older than our flags. "This pipe has ended storms and begun families," Iron Bear said, not loudly, yet every ear bent. It is a circle. Smoke rises, carries the words we mean into the kind of listening that cannot be tricked. If ever there is to be peace here, two breaths must meet in the same sky. The world went very soft. Thomas felt his heart drum in a rhythm that matched no march he had ever trained to. The pain in his back did not leave him. It simply stepped aside to let awe pass. He understood with an animal clarity that he stood, tethered, bleeding, at the threshold of something immense and tender, dangerous and kind. Love, yes, but also the ancient courage of making kin where enmity had been law. A shadow fell across the yard, and Thomas looked up to find not a storm cloud, but a plume of dust along the road, a different cadence of hoofbeats than the first patrol, lighter, more measured, less like a warning than like a procession. Men raised hands to browse against the glare. Even Iron Bear turned. The younger warrior's lips parted with surprise, the older's eyes softened. At the gate, a small group of riders drew into view, women at the center, buckskin dresses bead bright in the sun. Ribbons flashed at horse manes, silver chimed from braids, and there a figure Thomas knew before he could name her, as one recognizes a remembered dream made real by morning light. Her presence passed through him like cool water and warm fire at once, a healing heat, a soft breath easing a tight chest. The guard, confused and enthralled, lifted the bar. The riders entered with a gravity that outshone spectacle. In that instant, the fort ceased to be only a fort. It became a room in a house with a door open to sky, and life stepped through. The air turned ceremonial without anyone issuing an order. Men straightened not from fear, but because something sacred asks the body to stand tall. Ayana's eyes found Thomas's, and everything else, the ropes, the blood, the impossible math of politics, fell away like old leaves. The look held steady across the distance, full of the same gentleness he had protected, and the same courage that had brought her here between worlds. The blue and white beads at Thomas's chest answered her with small music, a bell-struck promise. I am yours. I am learning how to belong. Iron Bear said nothing. A father does not narrate a sunrise to the sun. He stepped back, and the space between his daughter and the man who had carried pain for her opened like a path. Harrison did not speak either. He stood very still, an expression on his face that Thomas had never seen. A man putting down, if only for a breath, the heavy armor of role to let his human heart look at a miracle. The women arranged themselves in a gentle half-circle, and the fort, the sky, the horses, the breath of every living thing leaned in. Ayana swung down from her horse, her feet finding the earth with the quiet confidence of someone who believes the land is listening. She approached without hurry, her hands cradling something Thomas could not yet see. She stopped just shy of touching distance, and her voice, careful, steady, warm as sun on winter skin, carried the kind of healing that travels in simple truths. The world held its breath, not in dread this time, but in reverence. The beads at Thomas's chest trembled, making their own small dawn, and the moment pressed forward, ready to become a promise. Ayana's hands opened like a sunrise. From the beaded pouch at her waist she drew the carved bird, no longer plain wood, but set upon a strand of blue and white beads threaded with tiny silver bells that sighed when the breeze touched them. The sunlight skipped along the necklace, turning every bead into a brief star. She held it where Thomas could see, her expression steady as river water, filled with that quiet bravery he had recognized the first time he looked into her eyes. "I made this for you," she said, each word careful and beautifully placed, like someone laying stones across a stream so others could cross. "I worked while I prayed that your breath would stay with you. Every bead is a promise. Every stitch is a thank you." The bells chimed softly, a tender music that made the square feel less like a fort and more like a room where the world had come to listen. Thomas could not lift his bound hands to receive what was already his, but Ayanna seemed to understand. She stepped close, hesitation a brief shadow that passed and was gone. With a grace that honored both his pain and his pride, she raised the necklace and draped it over his chest. The cool beads slipped against torn cloth and heated skin, and the sensation was so precise, so alive, that he had to close his eyes. Something within him, tightened for too long, released. Not the pain, the loneliness. "I wanted you to hear the bells," she said, barely above a whisper, "so you would know you are not alone, even when the world is loud." Her gaze lifted to his, and for a long breath the two of them stood inside a circle no one else could enter. The scarlet of his wounds, the earth-brown of the yard, the blue-white song at his chest, together they made a language that had no need of translation. Chief Iron Bear did not move to break that circle. He watched with the generosity of a father who knows that in some moments the only right act is to step aside. When he did speak, he spoke to the day itself as much as to the colonel, his voice low, even, ceremonial, without pomp. He unwrapped the red stone pipe, its surface glinting like heart-blood, polished by years of touch. "Where I come from," he said, "when a man carries pain for a woman's safety, we call his courage by its true name. We meet him at the threshold and offer kinship, so his suffering does not wander without a home." The fort seemed to lean closer, as if timber and nail could listen. Harrison's jaw worked, and the lines at the corners of his eyes deepened, not with hardness, but with the burden of choosing the least harmful door in a corridor of bad ones. He watched the pipe as if it were both a relic and a question. "Chief," he said, "you know the law I'm bound to. You know what I'm expected to say." Iron Bear nodded. "I know. And I am not asking for your law to call this good, only that your hand not close on a thing that does not belong to it." His eyes moved to Thomas. The kindness in them was a steady fire. "My daughter asks me to make a bridge. I have never placed it in a soldier's path before. I place it now." Thomas swallowed against the roughness in his throat. The ropes soared at his wrists with every breath, yet the world felt strangely gentle, as if everything harsh had been wrapped in soft cloth for a single fragile hour. He looked at Ayanna, at the small bells resting over his heart, and something inside him answered to a truer name than rank: husband. The word rose in him unbidden, shy and strong, like a seedling pushing through last winter's frost. Ayanna's voice found him. "When I saw you stand between me and harm, I knew the shape of your spirit," she said, the music of her accent turning the words into prayer. "I knew it in the way you did not touch what was not yours. I knew it in the way your anger did not look at me. It only looked at injustice." Colour warmed her cheeks, but her gaze never faltered. "If you walk toward me, I will meet you. If you choose my people, we will choose you. There is room in our lodge for your scars and your dreams." Her father lifted the pipe, and the sun flashed along its edge. The warriors' faces remained calm masks, but their eyes softened. The shift one sees when men sense a story turning away from the cliff by the width of a hand. The colonel took off his hat and held it in both hands, a gesture older than politics. He was a man listening to something beyond orders, the small, luminous voice inside that tells us, without fanfare, the difference between what is legal and what is right. "You are asking me," Harrison said to Iron Bear, then to the moment, "not to bless what I cannot, but to refuse to ruin what may be holy." He breathed, and the breath seemed to travel through the ranks as if carried on a wind they had all been waiting for. "The last 6 lashes will not fall," he said. "Not today, and not ever. Private Brennan's service is at an end, by his own choice, under my authority, and with no claim to punishment beyond this hour." The words landed softly and shook everything. Hands that had gripped rifles eased. Boots shifted, as if men remembered their feet belonged to earth before they belonged to marching. The lieutenant who had brought bad news lowered his head a fraction, like someone feeling a weight lift he hadn't realized he was carrying. And Thomas, who had stood as long as a body can stand, felt the rope not so much loosen as become irrelevant. The only bind left was to the look in Ayana's eyes. Iron Bear stepped nearer and held the pipe where both Thomas and Ayana could see. "This has ended storms and begun families," he said. "If you breathe together, you will be kin before the spirits and our people. It does not erase the white man's papers or make small the anger of those who want war more than peace. It will not make your road easy." The faintest smile turned his mouth. "It will make it true." A murmur stirred the ranks, a bristle of fear and fascination. Thomas felt all of it, the risk, the unknown, the way a future can open like a canyon and a home at the same time. But when he met Ayana's gaze, fear moved aside for the simple clarity of what mattered. He nodded to the chief, because his voice would not yet come. He turned his face, slightly, to the sky. The first breath was Ayana's. She took the pipe with reverent hands and lifted it as she had been taught, eyes closing for a heartbeat, lashes trembling like wings at rest. Smoke curled, thin and clean, carrying the scent of sweetgrass and something older than memory. She passed it to Iron Bear, and he guided it to Thomas's mouth, careful as if tending a newborn flame. Thomas drew in. The smoke was cool at first, then warm, and when he released it, the rising thread felt like a prayer made visible, a line stitched between his breath and hers, between the ground and whatever listens. The bells at his chest answered with a music so gentle he might have imagined it, but he did not imagine the hush that fell, or the way even the horseflies seemed to drift aside as if unwilling to break the surface of that stillness. The fort smelled of pine smoke and leather, blood and dust. Layered over all of it, a new fragrance. Hope, thin but real, like a green thing nosing up through ash. Harrison turned his head, and Thomas saw with a shock of tenderness that the colonel's eyes were bright. Not with weeping exactly, but with the recognition that he had just placed his own small stone in the bed of a river and changed the water's course by a fraction possible only to the faithful. He gestured to his sergeant. "Cut him loose," he said. "Mind his wounds." Steel whispered against rope. The fibers parted. Thomas's arms fell heavy, and pains sang through him, bright and immediate. He staggered, and Ayana was there before he could fall, her hands sure at his shoulders, her presence like shade after noon heat, like a warm blanket in the night. He leaned into her without shame. To be held, then, was not weakness. It was a truth finally allowed to speak. A cheer rose, ragged, bewildered, real. Not all the voices joined it. That, too, was honest. The older warrior began a low song, and the younger, after a heartbeat's hesitation, hummed under it, adding a second line that felt like water braided with wind. The sound curled along the buildings and climbed the flagpole and climbed the day. Men who had never heard such music before felt something in their chests answer it, an ache they carried without a name, the homesickness we feel even while standing in our own doorways until love gives the house a light. Iron Bear knelt and touched the earth with his palm, then pressed that palm to his chest. He looked up at Harrison, and the look contained a whole treaty more honest than any parchment. Harrison, for his part, inclined his head as one soldier to another. He had not abandoned his post. He had defended it against the oldest enemy, the part of the law that forgets to be human. "Thomas Brennan," the chief said, speaking the name as if returning it to its owner with honor attached, "you are welcome to our fire if you wish to learn our ways, our words, our seasons. You will not be a curiosity, but a man with duties and joys. If you choose, you will be my daughter's husband. If you are afraid, that is not shame, only a sign that you see clearly. We will not rush your feet." Thomas looked from Iron Bear to Ayana and then to the far hills beyond the palisade, hills he had ridden past 100 times without seeing. He thought of his mother's letters tied with twine in his trunk, of winter drills, of the smell of cavalry leather and coffee burnt in tin. He thought of the lie easy choices tell, that comfort is safety, that obedience is peace. He touched with shaking fingers the blue and white beads over his heart, and felt their tiny coolness steady him. "I will learn your words," he said, voice raw but clear, "if you'll be patient when I stumble." He glanced at Ayana, and love brought a faint, incredulous smile to his mouth. "I will learn the songs your hands already know." Her answering smile undid him, not because it was beautiful, though it was, because it carried forgiveness he hadn't known he needed, and welcome he had not dared to hope for. "We will go slow," she said, "like water teaching stone." The lieutenant stepped forward, the nervousness of a man who remembers there is still a map with black marks on it. "Colonel," he said quietly, "the southern road—" "I know," Harrison answered, but his voice had changed. Determination lived there now, tempered by a tenderness that would make him dangerous to the wrong kind of order. "We ride at dawn, and we do not ride blind." He looked at Iron Bear. "If you have men who can read the ash of those fires, send them with us. Let truth be the first weapon we use." Iron Bear weighed the request, then nodded. "We will send eyes that do not lie," he said, "and ears that hear the small things men with fear in their heads cannot hear." Ayana eased Thomas toward a bench in the narrow seam of shade along the barracks wall. Every step was a stitch in a new quilt of reality. Bead song tapping his sternum, wind smoothing his skin, her presence holding him steady. A medic hovered, chastened by the day's gentleness, and offered water and salve. Thomas took the water, let the first cool mouthful undo a knot under his ribs, and felt the world soften around the edges. "I'm sorry," he said to Ayana, apology spilling from a man who had carried too much blame that didn't belong to him. "For the blood, for the noise, for the way my world has come crashing into yours." She shook her head, braids whispering, bells answering. "We are both standing where our worlds meet," she said. "If we listen carefully, this place is a doorway, not a wound." Her fingers, light as breath, hovered over his back where the salve glistened. Healing took the shape of nearness. He let his eyes drift to the sky, blue, unbroken, a mercy. The future rose around him, immense and tender. He would learn to say her name in her own language the way a man says home. He would fail and laugh and try again. He would sit at her fire and learn the stories that teach children who they are. He would walk beside Iron Bear and plant in the earth what a soldier's life had not taught him to cultivate. He would carry what he owed and set down what he didn't, again and again, like a prayer said properly, with humility and breath. Across the yard, Harrison issued quiet orders that sounded less like commands and more like the arrangements families make when preparing for a difficult journey. Food, water, rest, the choosing of those who will go and those who will keep the lights. The fort returned to motion, but a new current ran through it, gentler than the old, no less strong. Men found work for their hands that didn't draw blood. Someone brought bread. Someone else refilled the medic's basin. The world, which had seemed made of iron, proved itself capable of warmth. Iron Bear stood and looked to the gate, reading distance and time the way men like him read the sky. He spoke soft to his warriors, who answered with nods that contained whole paragraphs. Then he turned back, and his gaze landed on Thomas once more, as if to confirm a fact his heart already knew. The chief smiled again, the same small, bright smile that had lit the day before any cheer did. "We will make camp just beyond your sight," he said. "So when morning finds you, it will not find you alone." Ayana's hand folded around Thomas's. The bells gave their gentle voice. He answered by threading his fingers through hers, surprised by how natural the gesture felt, as if he had always been moving toward this exact interlacing. The medic stepped away, leaving a neat row of clean cloths and a tin of salve. "Rest," Ayana murmured. "The body listens when we ask kindly." He nodded. He rested. The bench pressed its cool board against his legs, the shade draped itself like a blessing, and the murmuring of men and horses settled into a low, living hum. He let the hum hold him. Pain, no longer the only language, negotiated its place among others. Gratitude, hope, awe, the strange, deep relief of being seen and chosen. The sun leaned west. Shadows lengthened like vows. Outside the gates, the world spread open, prairie whispering, river murmuring indecipherable promises, hills wearing their evening gold. Inside, a soldier laid down his service and picked up a life. The difference between the two was measured not in stripes or pay, but in the feel of a small carved bird tapping against his chest when he breathed. Ayana watched him with the attentive quiet of someone guarding a candle in a wind. "When you are ready," she said, "I will take you to the edge of the yard, and you will put your feet on the path that knows my name. My people will meet you. My father will say words that make us kin. And after, you will eat and sleep and wake to the sound of morning. We will begin again." He met her eyes, the answer already alive there. Between them, the day's smoke rose in slender threads, carrying truth to whatever listens. Beyond them, the fort gathered itself for dawn, and along the gate's threshold, where wood meets earth, where fear meets courage, the story waited, warm and patient, ready to walk with them into whatever light the next hour would offer. Night folded over the fort with the gentleness of a shawl, dimming the hard angles of palisade and barracks until even the timber seemed to exhale. Lanterns woke one by one along the yard like quiet stars. Somewhere a horse stamped, an iron ring clinked against wood, and the day's sharpness softened into the healing murmur of low voices and wind. Thomas sat on the bench in the seam of shade that had turned to lantern glow, bare from the waist up, while salve cooled the heat in his back. The blue and white beads Ayana had given him lay against his chest, a soft weight and a small music, as if the night itself had a heartbeat he could wear. Ayana's hands moved with a calm that steadied the air around them. She opened a small bundle of herbs and pounded them to paste with a round river stone, the scent of sweetgrass and willow rising like a blessing. When she touched the salve to his skin, she did it as if listening. Her fingers found each lash as though she had walked its length and knew where the pain curved and where it bit. He did not flinch, not because it did not hurt, but because her touch carried a quiet that pain obeyed. "Breathe with me," she said softly, slow, the way the river speaks to stones. He matched her rhythm, in, out. Pain, once the only language, learned new words: hush, warmth, release. He felt the night receive his breath and give it back, sweeter. The bells threaded among the beads chimed when he drew a deeper lungful, and the sound met the lantern light as if the two were kin. Iron Bear stood a little way off, a silhouette against the paler strip of sky along the open gate. He had the stillness of a tree that has seen storms and knows how to bend without breaking. When he finally stepped forward, he came without urgency, carrying the redstone pipe wrapped in soft hide. Harrison walked beside him, hat in hand. The colonel's uniform seemed less like armor tonight and more like a story he was willing to set down. They stopped before the bench. For a moment no one spoke, and the silence was not empty. It was a bowl you could drink from. Harrison cleared his throat. "We'll ride at first light," he said, voice low, as if unwilling to bruise the hour. "We follow the south road, find whose fires those were. If they are not Lakota, I mean to know it before anyone hangs blame on your people." His eyes lifted to Iron Bear. "Your scouts will meet us?" "They will be waiting where the river splits," Iron Bear answered. "They know the Ashes' language." He shifted his gaze to Thomas. "And you, young man? Do your feet know their mourning?" Thomas glanced down at his hands, the rope marks dark bracelets around his wrists, and then at the beads lying cool over his sternum. He had worn many marks in his life: a boy's scraped knees, a soldier's calluses, the pale line beneath his collarbone where a winter fever had almost taken him. None felt as honest as the pattern Ayana's hands had laid upon him. He reached up and cupped the carved bird through the cloth. The wood's curve fit his palm as if it had been waiting for that shape all along. "They know," he said. The words steadied as he spoke them. "I'll leave at dawn. Not with the column, with her. He didn't need to say Ayana's name. His voice knew it even when it was silent. If there is a paper to sign, I'll sign it. If there is a door to walk through, I'll walk. Harrison looked at him a long moment, the way a man inspects the hinge of a gate he has oiled himself. Then he nodded once and unclasped a leather folio. "You were never a coward," he said. "This is not desertion. It is a discharge under my hand and seal for cause I am prepared to defend. You owe this army your honesty. You paid that debt with 30 lashes. You owe this life your truth. You're paying that now with your choice." He took a breath that left him lighter. "There's a bunk and a blanket in the infirmary, if you'll take them, and a clean shirt. You've done enough standing for one day." Iron Bear's eyes warmed. "A man who speaks this way makes room for other men to be human," he said to Harrison. Then to Thomas, "When sun breaks, we will walk the short road to the place where our camp breathes. There will be coffee you do not like at first, and bread you will ask for again. There will be a lodge that belongs to my daughter. She will open its door, and you will enter as a guest. If, after eating and resting, you still carry the word husband in your chest, you will speak, and I will answer." Thomas felt the word move within him, shy no longer. It found his ribs and settled there like small fire. He did not speak it aloud. He only looked at Ayana. She had set aside the bowl and cleaned her hands, wiping each finger with a scrap of soft hide. Now she drew from her pouch a slender strip of buckskin. On it she had beaded a narrow pattern in the same sky-bright blues and cloud whites as his necklace. The strip was unfinished. The thread still ran from the last bead like a silver vein. "For your wrist," she said, raising it. "Not to bind, to remind." She touched the rope mark with a feather-light fingertip, and then tied the beaded strip above it. "When your skin remembers hurt, let it also remember tenderness." He watched the knot settle, small and sure. "What does the pattern say?" he asked. Her mouth softened in that smile he had begun to crave the way a thirsty man craves water. "It says, breathe easy and go slowly, and the door is open." She cocked her head, listening to him the way she listened to his breath. "And now," she added, voice a whisper of warmth, "it also says, Thomas." He nearly laughed for joy. He had known how to stand in lines, how to take orders, how to sleep with his boots under his bedroll and his rifle within reach. He had not known how to be named by love and not by rank. The discovery felt like shade after noon heat, like a hand smoothing the hair at a child's crown, the oldest healing in the world. Iron Bear unwrapped the pipe and set it upon the bench, not between them, but near enough to be felt. "We did not finish a marriage today," he said. "We began a kinship. The rest will come when the morning is honest and our people are watching. For now, we will let the night teach us how to be gentle with what is new." The colonel looked at the pipe as if it were a compass he had never been taught to read. "I don't know your prayers," he admitted, "but I can keep watch." He shifted his weight, hands open, as if presenting empty palms to prove he meant no harm. "If anyone comes through these gates tonight with the wrong kind of purpose, they'll find me in their way." Iron Bear's smile was brief and bright. "Then the night has 2 guardians," he said. "That is enough." They left Thomas and Ayana to their hush. The medic returned with a folded shirt and a small tin of salve. Ayana accepted both with a nod, the quiet business of care continuing as naturally as breath. When she guided the shirt over Thomas's shoulders, she did it the way women lift a sleeping child and never wake him. The cotton grazed his back. He winced, then relaxed into the fabric's cool. She smoothed it along his sides, fingers careful of the new lines the lashes had written there, and her tenderness translated the raw script into something the body could bear. Not a sentence, a story. "Where will you sleep?" he asked, feeling clumsy to ask even that. The question felt like a stone with soft moss on it. Simple, alive. "In the women's shelter by the gate," she said. "My father wishes us to honor the steps. The heart runs fast. The feet must be wise." The bells chimed, approval in miniature. "But I will be near, close enough that if you breathe a troubled breath, I will hear it." He had never been told that his breathing mattered. It moved through him like a benediction. The fort, which had been tense even in rest for as long as he could remember, settled under the hush that certain nights bring when mercy makes itself at home. Men spoke in softer voices, out of respect they could not have explained. A harmonica sighed a lullaby from a corner. Someone hummed under it, and the tune wove itself along the yard like a river finding an old channel. The horses slept standing, heads low, tails flicking in slow metronomes. Over all of it, the lanterns kept their small, faithful suns, and the moon lifted a white bowl of light above the palisade. Thomas's eyes grew heavy. He had meant to write a letter, to his mother, to the boy he had been when the ink on his enlistment paper was still wet. But the night told him there would be time for words after rest. He let his head tip forward, and Ayana's shoulder was there, as if it had always been meant for it. He dozed while she watched, and watching, she learned the cadence of his sleep, the way a healer learns a pulse, the way his breath lengthened when the pain cooled, the small catch when a lash woke, the way the beads at his chest answered with their shy bell when a deeper peace found him. When he stirred, the moon had moved. The yard had grown quieter still, that deep hour when even the crows spend their voices. Ayana pressed a cool cloth onto the hot points of his back and then drew it down in a long, slow stroke. "Morning is near," she whispered. "Your new feet are waiting." He blinked the last fog from his eyes and looked at her, and looking at her was like remembering a name he had spoken in another life. "I'm ready," he said, and the words surprised him with their softness. Not the hardness of resolve, the pliancy of trust. They stood. The motion tugged at the wounds, and he swayed. Her hand was already at his elbow, sure and warm. They crossed the yard in a seam of lantern light, passing men who rose and nodded, not because the army told them to, but because something older had. At the gate, Harrison stood with 2 sentries, his hat on, his coat open to the night. He did not stop them. He simply stepped aside and gave a short blessing with his eyes. "Be well," he said. "Be safe." The words were plain and therefore perfect. Iron Bear waited beyond the gate with his warriors and 3 women who had come with Ayana, an aunt, a cousin, and a grandmother by the look of them, though Thomas could not be sure. They were wrapped in shawls beaded with designs that caught the moonlight, galaxies stitched by patient hands. One of them carried a small pot covered with cloth. Steam rose through the weave. Coffee, yes, but with a sweetness he did not know. "Drink," the aunt said, offering a tin cup. "It will put the night in the right places." He smiled and did as he was told. The bitterness surprised him, and then dissolved beneath the brown sugar the women had tucked into the pot. Warmth travelled outward from his chest and into his fingers. The old woman's eyes, black stones polished by rivers of years, crinkled with approval. She reached up and patted his sleeve as if to set the warmth there. They walked. Not far, just beyond the horizon of the fort's sight, to a small resting camp where 3 tipis stood like pale shells. A low fire drew a ring of light on the earth. The stars moved above it, unhurried, generous. Someone had laid a pallet of soft skins and blankets near the quietest side of the fire, where the wind did not poke and the smoke knew to lift another way. Ayana led him to it and knelt to tuck the lowest blanket's edge beneath his side so it would not lift. Her care was a language that said everything without saying anything. Rest. I am here. You can let go now. Iron Bear sat across the fire, the pipe beside his knee. He did not unwrap it. He only watched the flames and hummed a tune so low it might have been the earth answering itself. The warriors settled like shadows near the outer ring of light, so soft that even the crickets did not bother to hush for them. The women spoke together in voices that barely rose above the fire's breath. Thomas caught his name among their words and felt something like homesickness turn to home. Ayana's palms hovered above his back for a moment, not touching, warming. "Sleep," she said, "and let your bones remember soft ground." He closed his eyes. He had slept in barracks, in tents, under wagons, in ditches. He had never slept with a prayer made of hands and breath laid over him like this. The pain found its smaller place and curled there like an animal that had finally been fed. He drifted. The bells at his chest made their small promise each time his breathing deepened. When he woke, the world was the pale green of a sky nearly ready for birdsong. Dew jeweled the grass. The fire had banked to coals that pulsed like a living heart. Ayana was seated at his side, braids pooled over her shoulder, eyes bright with the thin light of almost morning. She was beading, the small needle flashing, the thread slipping through cloth with the soft hush of rain. "What now?" he asked, voice husky with sleep. She looked up, and the first bird of the day took that moment to sing, the sound so precise and clean it put a sheen on everything. "Now we wash," she said. "We eat. We listen. Then we walk to where our people are gathered." A blush found her cheeks, tender as dawn. "Then I will speak to them about the man whose hands knew how not to harm." His throat tightened so quickly he had to swallow twice. "You'll speak for me." "I will speak for us," she said simply. "And my father will answer." The women brought water, warmed to kindness, in a brass pot. Steam curled and vanished in the morning air. Ayana dipped a cloth and pressed it to his back, and the warmth seeped into the red tracks and told them the night was over. The old woman sprinkled dried petals into the bowl and gave a small cluck with her tongue, satisfied when the scent rose, summer in winter's mouth. Healing, thin and real, travelled his skin. Iron Bear stood, and the camp stood with him. The chief walked to Thomas and held out a hand. Thomas took it. The grip was firm and unhurried, the hand of a man who knew his own strength and did not have to prove it. "Come," Iron Bear said, and the single word contained a father's blessing and a leader's invitation. "It is time to let morning see what night has begun." They set off toward the main camp, a small procession threading between river and rise. The land opened. The song of water ran at their left, a silver line speaking in its ancient tongue. To their right, meadow rolled toward distant hills brushed with gold. The air carried the clean smell of cut willow and the faint smoke of far-cooking fires. Each step Thomas took felt less like walking away and more like walking into something that had been calling him for years without a name he could hear. Ayana walked at his side. Once, she reached out and linked her smallest finger with his, the way a child and a lover both pledge without ceremony. He looked down. That small touch held more truth than any oath he had sworn in a room full of men. They crested a slight shoulder of earth, and the camp revealed itself. A scattering of teepees like pale stones laid by a careful river. Horses moving with the war-in grace of belonging, children arrowing between shadows, women tending fires that flashed bright and then settled into useful heat. Voices rose like birds, lifting all at once, not in alarm, but in curiosity and welcome. Thomas felt his breath catch, not with fear, with recognition. He did not know this place, but some deep part of him knew how a place like this made a man. With song, with work, with story, with the quiet pride of women whose hands could mend anything from a tear in a shirt to a tear in a heart. Iron Bear raised his hand, and the murmur changed. It grew focused, a stream narrowing to pass through a smooth stone gap. He turned to Thomas, his face both solemn and easy. "Your feet kept their promise," he said. "Now let your heart keep its courage." Ayana stepped ahead, bells answering the morning. She paused, looked back at Thomas, and then looked toward her people with the fierce sweetness of someone who knows what she wants and is not afraid to say it. He stood very still and listened to the new day. Somewhere behind them, far off, a bugle called men to saddles. The note floated and faded, a parting that did not feel like a wound. Beside him, the river spoke of a long patience. Before him, a future arranged itself without needing to be forced. Rooms that smelled of coffee and bread, winters with stories and summers with horses, children who would carry two names like a double star. Ayana drew breath to speak. The bells at his chest trembled, and the morning listened. The first sound was the river. It spoke in the hush between Ayana's inhaled breath and her first word, a silver voice slipping over stones as if to bless what was about to be said. She stood with the light on her face and the bells at her throat chiming their small courage. Around her, the camp's mourning gathered, 1,000 quiet things aligning to make a listening, the hiss of flatbread laid to griddle, a colt's impatient snort, the soft thud of wood set beside a fire, children settling near their mothers as if story time had arrived by accident. Ayana did not raise her arms, did not call for silence. She did not need to. The way she held herself, steady, tender, certain, was a summons older than drums. Her eyes moved over the circle and returned to Thomas, and when she turned back to her people, her voice came low and clear, like water that knows the way. 3 nights ago, she said, I stood in a shadow that was not mine. Hands that did not belong to me reached where my spirit would not let them. A soldier made a doorway with his body and stood there until the shadow broke. She paused, and the pause was gentle, letting grief pass without clutching it. I saw his eyes. They did not hate. They did not take. They remembered that I am a person. A murmur, soft as wind in grass, moved through the circle. Women's voices first, then men's, then the small, restless bodies of children who recognize the shape of a story that keeps them safe. Iron Bear stood at the edge of things with the look of a man who knows a seed when he sees it, a quiet attention that neither hurries nor delays growth. Ayana's gaze brushed the elders. She did not plead. She included. I saw his hands, she continued. They did not come close to me except to help me stand. When I pressed a carved bird into his palm, he did not call it nothing. He held it like he knew what a girl's prayer feels like when it becomes wood. Thomas listened and felt his breath catch on a thread of wonder. He had expected argument, explanation, the careful building of a case. She offered witness instead, and the truth of it moved through the air with its own legs. The blue and white beads at his chest rested calm and cool, their weight a hearthstone keeping the room warm. A boy of about 10 slipped from the ring and sat cross-legged at Ayana's feet, chin on fists. His sister crawled into their grandmother's lap and peered over her arm with unblinking solemnity. A young warrior, braid tied with a strip of red cloth, folded his arms and narrowed his eyes, not in anger, but as if bringing distant mountains into focus. The old women remained very still, lakes without wind, their knowing too deep to ripple. Ayana's voice softened. When the lashes fell, I thought about his breath. I asked the spirits to keep it steady. I made this. She touched the necklace at Thomas's chest, and the bells answered. Every bead said, "Stay." Every knot said, "I am with you, even if we are far." She turned to Iron Bear, and something in her face shifted. The strength of a daughter who has always been heard, asking to be heard again in a way that would change the world. "Father," she said, "I have watched men who can hunt winter and catch spring. I have seen boys become men by learning how to hold their anger the way a good rider holds a horse. I have dreamed, since I learned to braid my hair without help, of a husband whose hands know how not to harm, whose eyes remember the person in front of him before they remember himself. I found him in a place we call enemy." The words did not shock so much as settle, as if they had been waiting in the circle for someone to lay them carefully in the center. Iron Bear tilted his head, and the crow's feet, carved by 1,000 smiles, deepened. He did not interrupt. He let his daughter measure the day with her own string. Ayana breathed once, as if to steady a bowl brim full, and stepped aside so the circle could see Thomas without needing to crane. He stood with the river behind him and the camp before him, no longer in uniform, only a clean shirt, his trousers, and the marks of rope at his wrists, like the shadows of broken bracelets. He did not know where to put his hands, so he set them palm open at his sides where everyone could read them. Nothing hidden. "This is what I bring." "I ask you," Ayana said, and the words had no tremble, "to look at him with the eyes you use for truth. If you see what I see, I ask that you make room by our fire for a man whose feet will stumble in our language at first, whose hands will be clumsy with our customs, but whose heart already walks our way. If you do not see it, I will listen. If you do, I will speak the word that ties my name to his." Her father's gaze travelled the circle like a slow bird skimming water. He did not seek approval. He sought honesty. "Speak," he said, and the invitation was for all, not just one. A woman old enough to be mother to the grandmothers lifted her chin. Her braid was a long white river down her back. She pointed her lips toward Thomas, the way a person points them at a deer they are watching. "Come closer," she said. Thomas's heart stumbled, then steadied. He crossed the worn earth at the circle's edge, with the same care he would use crossing a stream on slick stones. He stopped where the woman could see him without squinting. She gestured to his hands. "Turn them." He turned them, palms forward, then up, then down. The woman studied the calluses, the scars, the small crescent near the thumb, where he had bit the skin as a boy when a dare went wrong. She looked up. "These are not soft," she said, and her voice carried something like approval. "Not the hands of a man who lets life be done to him." Her eyes moved to the rope marks. She touched the bead strip Ayana had tied there as lightly as morning touches far hills. "This is good," she added, and some tension he hadn't known he was holding walked out of his shoulders and went to sit elsewhere. A young man stood, the one with the strip of red in his braid. "We have blood in our mouths," he said, and the words were not an accusation, they were a weather report. "Wagons burned to the south. The world looks for a throat to close its hand on. Why should we bring a soldier where our children sleep?" Thomas felt the question land in the center of himself like a stone dropped into a well. He did not look to Iron Bear or Ayana to answer for him. He stepped forward a half step, enough to belong to his own voice. "Because I stood where harm was," he said quietly, "and made shame turn its face away. Because I learned that night that my oath was not a uniform. They are not the same thing. Because if you give me a child to watch, that child will learn he is safe, not because I say so, but because nothing will happen while I breathe that makes it otherwise." The young man listened with his whole body. His eyes did not soften, but his mouth loosened a fraction, as if a bowstring had been eased a notch. He didn't sit. He looked at Ayana instead, as if to hear in her silence what her answer was. She did not look away. She let him read her, and what he read must have been enough, because he nodded once, a small concession a proud man makes when he chooses sense over heat. A girl of perhaps 16 stepped into the circle's light. Her hair was braided with 4 tiny shells that whispered when she moved. She pointed to the beads at Thomas's chest. "Did you keep it when it was only wood?" she asked, and the question struck with the strange, pure power of youth. Thomas smiled before he could help himself. "Yes," he said, the word warm, like a man holds a promise he doesn't know the words of yet. That made the girl smile too, quick and shy. She went back to her place, abashed by her own boldness and pleased by it as well, the way a foal is surprised and delighted by its first clean gallop. An elder rose, a man with a jaw like the edge of a mountain and eyes as kind as a valley. He spoke to Iron Bear first, as was right. When we bring in a man from another fire, we bring in his storms too. But I have watched storms carry seeds. I have watched them shake fruit from trees that were too proud to bend. I have seen the plains lay flat for fire and rise green after. If this soldier is a storm, I think he is the kind that leaves water. Laughter moved through the circle, not loud, but true, relief shaken loose from the rafters. The elder's gaze slid to Thomas. "You will not expect to be praised for breathing," he said, "and you will not leave if the work is heavy?" "I will not," Thomas answered, and to his surprise, saying it brought pleasure so sharp he had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from grinning like a boy. Iron Bear lifted his hand, and the air settled again. He turned to Harrison then, who stood a respectful distance behind the circle with two of his men, hats in restless hands. The colonel had come not to watch a curiosity, but to witness a covenant. Iron Bear addressed him as one leader to another who has chosen not to carry a sword into a church. "You have eyes today," he said, "that do not swing like doors in the wind. Keep them. When your men ride south, let truth lead. If it is our fire, we will answer. If it is not, do not hang it on our necks because it fits." Harrison's jaw worked once, and when he spoke, there was the slightest rasp in his voice, as if he had swallowed smoke and turned it to something he could speak with. "I will do as I said," he answered. "We ride for truth at first light, and I will tell whatever men come from the capital that the world is bigger than their papers." He took off his hat and did a thing Thomas had never seen him do. He bowed to the circle, not deeply, not theatrically, but with the gravity of a man who knows the rightness of the hour he is in. Iron Bear nodded and returned to the matter at hand. He picked up a small pouch from the earth beside him. When he opened it, the smell of sweetgrass lifted. Fresh hay, clean rain, sunlight caught in a braid. He fed a pinch to the fire. The smoke turned briefly greener, and men drew it into their lungs and let it go, and the children breathed without being told why. Then the chief retrieved the pipe and laid it across his palms. He did not light it. He looked at his daughter instead. "Ayana," he said, speaking her name with all the miles he had walked to bring her safely to this morning. "What is the word you prepared in the night?" Her cheeks coloured with a heat that belonged to courage, not embarrassment. She stepped into the very centre of the circle and faced Thomas. When she spoke, her voice was not small. It was precise, like a needle pulling thread through leather, each syllable piercing, each leaving a stitch. "I choose you," she said. It was not the beginning of a paragraph. It was the whole sentence. The circle breathed in. The river seemed to hear. Even the horses lifted their heads and blew softly, as if some old agreement had just been renewed. She went on, shaping the rest of the promise. "I choose the way your anger knows its right place. I choose your breath when it slows with mine. I choose the work you will learn, and the mistakes you will make, and the laughter you will wear when you do both. I choose the nights when your back will ache, and my hands will remember where to press. I choose the mornings when I will braid your hair badly at first, laughter, gentle and bright, and you will teach me the words for your mother's songs." She drew breath, and the bells at her throat made their quiet shine. "I choose to stand with you where the world calls us wrong, and to be patient until truth ripens. I choose to be your home, and to let you be mine." Thomas had never been caught by a net so soft. He did not know where to put the flood of gratitude rising in him. It swelled in his chest and found his eyes instead. He stepped closer. The circle leaned with him, held him up the way a hand cups a bird, securely without crushing its breath. He could have spoken 100 thanks and not found the right one. So he said fewer words and let them be exact. "I choose you," he answered, and the way his mouth made the sound felt like a gate opening that had been rusted shut for years. I choose your voice when it steadies me. I choose your questions when I would hide, your hands when I am hurt, your laughter when I forget there is such a thing. I choose your people, the way your aunt pours coffee and the way your grandmother looks at the sky like she taught it how to turn blue. A ripple of smiling approval. I choose to learn your language until my tongue remembers it in its sleep. I choose the work you give me, hard or easy, because it keeps me near you. I choose to be your shelter and to let you shelter me. Iron Bear bowed his head to the pipe. The old women looked at one another and nodded, a soundless yes passing between them like a bird shadow on water. Children scooted forward until they nearly touched the edge of the sacred space. The young warrior's mouth tugged toward a smile he pretended not to have. The elder with the mountain jaw put a hand over his heart and said a word so soft only the nearest heard it. Good. The chief lifted the pipe and looked at Harrison. In your place, he said, would you strike this from our hands? Harrison shook his head once. In my place, he said, I would guard it. Iron Bear smiled. Not triumph, but relief braided with joy, and turned to the fire. He lowered the pipe to the flame and drew the smoke to life, then offered it first to the east and then to the west, to the south and then the north, to the sky and to the ground, to the river and to the fire itself, because the circle is not complete until every direction is invited to listen. He spoke low, words Thomas could not yet understand, but the feel of them was the feel of hands making room. He held the pipe to Ayana, and she breathed, one slow, reverent breath, and then another, a visible ribbon rising to tell whoever listens that a promise is walking into the world. He held it to Thomas. Thomas felt the bowl's heat, the mouth stem smooth with generations of vows. He closed his eyes and drew in smoke that tasted like grass and sunrise, and something that made the hairs stand at his neck. He let it go slowly. The ribbon rose and twined with Ayana's, and the two strands became one. And then neither was his alone any more. The camp saw it. The world saw it. That is what a ritual is for, to let the invisible become visible and the private become shared, so it can be defended by many hands and not only two. A sound began on the far side of the circle, low and round, like a drum remembering a song it had known in another life. A woman's voice joined, then another, then a man's, and without anyone telling them to, the people began to sing. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried all the distance it needed to, from the helper's hands to the wounded back, from the father's prayer to the daughter's vow, from the river to the sky. The song held space for dancing, and children took that space immediately, because children are the world's most faithful dancers. They stamped and spun and tripped and laughed, and their laughter braided itself to the song and made it brighter. Ayana reached for Thomas's hand. He gave it. They did not dance yet. They stood, hand in hand, and watched the people who would be their people move like water that had found a clear way between stones. An aunt pressed a warm piece of bread into Thomas's free hand. He bit and tasted smoke and salt and the soft center that makes a man close his eyes for a moment. He swallowed, and the bite became something else the body remembers when the world thins. Care. After the song, the circle opened a little. Work returned the way it always does when good things are done properly. Dogs to be fed, fires to be banked, a child to be wiped, a kettle to be refilled. But a thread remained, bright and taut, running from heart to heart around the space where the vows had just stood. No one would say it out loud, because saying it would be small beside the doing of it. But they all felt it. We are larger now. Iron Bear spoke last, because good leaders know how to be the final stitch that keeps the whole from unraveling. He placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder, careful of the lashes. "Wasong hing washte," he said, voice warm. "Good intention." He touched the beaded strip on Thomas's wrist. "Your name, until you earn the next one." Thomas nodded, though he did not yet know the sounds well enough to fasten them in his mouth. He knew the feel of them, how they settled like a cloak, how they fit as if he had been walking naked into wind until this moment. He looked at Ayana. She had tears on her lashes, and a smile that was not about happiness only, but about strength, the kind that grows where patience and love live long enough to have grandchildren. She squeezed his fingers. He squeezed back. The camp exhaled. The river kept speaking, tireless and kind. Harrison reached up as if to adjust his hat, and then didn't. The gesture interrupted by a thought he didn't put words to. He turned to his men and said something low, and the two soldiers, to their own surprise, stood with hands not on rifles but folded at their backs, as if remembering that being a man in a place of promise is its own posture. Ayana tugged Thomas toward the shade where a pot simmered. "You must eat," she said, practical as a prayer. "A man cannot make vows on an empty stomach." Her aunt laughed and handed him a bowl of stew that tasted of meat and roots, and a patience that had been born in many winters. He ate, and each mouthful did what good food does, reminded the body that it is loved. Children gathered, hungry not only for the smell rising from the bowl, but for the newness of him. One bold boy asked to see the beads at his chest, and Thomas bent so the child could touch the carved bird with caution, learned from watching his mother lift a newborn rabbit. The boy looked up, serious. "It sings," he announced, as if he had discovered something adults had missed. "It sings in his bones." Ayana's laugh spilled like sunlight through leaves. "Yes," she said, "that is the sound of a promise." Later, when the sun lifted higher and the camp settled into the day's shape, Iron Bear came to them with a final piece of gentleness. He set a small bundle at their feet, soft deer hide tied with sinew, shells at the knots. "This is for the walking between," he said. "Not a marriage yet, not only betrothal, a path. You will sleep in different lodges until the moon turns twice. You will work. You will learn. You will be seen. Then, if the word you spoke today is still alive, we will seal it with both fires and both laws." Thomas felt relief slide through him with the sweetness of cool water. Not because he did not want to be her husband now, but because wise love gave itself a runway. He looked at Ayana and saw the same easing in her shoulders. "We will walk it," he said. "And we will enjoy it," she added, the corner of her mouth quirking. "Do you know how to make a cradle board?" He shook his head, startled, and she laughed at his eyes. "I am teasing you," she said, then softened at the way his breath caught and smoothed again. "Mostly." The day leaned into afternoon. Harrison and his men mounted to ride the south road. He lifted 2 fingers to Iron Bear, and then, surprising himself, to Thomas. a small salute, not from officer to private, but from man to man. The column moved off at an easy lope, the dust rising behind them like a veil that did not quite hide them. When the sound faded, the camp's own music reclaimed the air. Pestles in mortars, a baby fussing, a woman singing under her breath while she mended a shirt with stitches so even they could have been laid by a stream. Ayana took Thomas to the river. They stepped down a little path where willows kept the sun kind. She knelt and cupped water, poured it over his wrists. The cool ran into the rope marks and told them a new story. She dipped a cloth, wrung it, and laid it along his back with the tenderness of someone who believes in tired muscles as much as in brave hearts. He closed his eyes and let healing become a simple thing. A damp cloth, a careful hand, the sound of water talking sense. "Tell me their names," he said at last, nodding toward the camp. "I want to begin." She did, pointing with her chin the way her people did. "That is my Aunt Suta. She bakes bread and breaks pride, and both are always softer after. That is my cousin Peter. She is fire and does not apologize for it. That is old man Red Cloud's brother's son, who has a jaw like a stump and a heart like a cinnamon roll, if we had such things." He laughed, which made her laugh, which made the river run brighter. They stood and walked back, and as they went, small introductions became small tasks, carrying a split log here, fetching a water gourd there, listening while a boy explained how to tie a horse so it could scratch its side on a pole without losing the knot. Thomas listened as if it were scripture, which, in a way, it was. When the sun tilted toward its gentler hours, Ayana led him to the edge of camp, where a circle of stakes marked an empty place on the earth. "Here," she said, with a pride so sweet it startled him. "The lodge my mother used to set her stories in. I will raise it again. Tomorrow we will cut poles. Today we will ask the ground's permission." She knelt and laid her palm on the soil. Thomas knelt too, feeling foolish for exactly 1 second, and then for no seconds at all, because his body knew what his mind did not, that asking permission is how a house becomes a home. When the sky began to think about dusk, Iron Bear returned with 2 men carrying a wrapped bundle between them. They set it down, and the chief gestured. "For your hands," he said to Thomas. Inside the hide lay tools, a draw knife with a bone handle, a rasp, a mallet polished by many fingers, an awl bright as a star. "Borrowed," Iron Bear added. "Returned when work is done, and better for your touch." Thomas traced the knife's curve with reverence. The tools fit his hand as if they had been looking for him as long as he had been looking for them. A deep, unassuming happiness rose in him, the kind a man gets from knowing he will earn his keep in ways he can see and touch. Evening built itself with the precision of a weaver adding the last rose to a blanket. Fires brightened, pots simmered, the first stars pried their eyes open. The elders gathered again, not for ceremony now, but to watch children play a game with stones and to argue amiably over whether the winter 3 years ago had been the cruel one or whether everyone had simply been younger then. Laughter made the blankets warmer. Ayana slipped her hand into Thomas's. The bells at her throat gave one last chime, the day's benediction. "Tomorrow," she said, "you will help carry poles, and I will teach you how to say the names of the directions so that when you pray you don't invite the west to eat with you when you meant the east." He grinned, and she grinned back. "And in the evening," she added, voice lowering into something that brushed his skin like the wing of a night bird. "My father will show you where the sage grows that cures the kind of ache you have. It is the kind that listens when you ask kindly." He nodded, throat full again. He wanted to tell her everything, how his mother had braided his hair badly and made breakfast well, how the first time he saw a buffalo he had to sit down because his legs forgot how to stand, how he had been afraid every day since he could remember, and how being afraid near her felt more like being awake than being in danger. But the words knew to wait. They would come, many small, some large. Tonight, the work was simpler: to sit, to eat, to let the camp's warmth soak into him until the day's cold boiled off. They did that. They sat with her father and his friends and listened to a story that took as long as a pot of beans to soften. They ate, and no one measured how much, and no one rushed them when they asked for second helpings. When it was time to sleep, Iron Bear pointed his chin toward the aunt's lodge for Thomas and toward the women's shelter for Ayana. She walked him as far as the flap, stopped, and looked up into his face with a tenderness that made something behind his ribs give way. "Breathe easy," she whispered, and the words wove themselves through his bones the way the beaded strip circled his wrist. "Go slowly. The door is open." He wanted to kiss her then, wanted it with a wanting that was not hunger but gratitude on fire. He did not. He lifted her hand and touched his mouth to the backs of her fingers. The oldest kiss, the one men give queens and healers and women who teach them how to live. She flushed, pleased and surprised, and her eyes shone the way stars do when they fall on water. He ducked into the aunt's lodge and lay down on a bed that smelled of clean fur and cedar. He heard the camp's last little noises, as if tucked inside a mother's dress. A pan set gently aside, a baby scolding sleep until sleep laughed and picked it up anyway, a low conversation in which a man told a woman about a dream of fish so many the river wore jewels, and the woman said not to put such big wishes in the water without saying thank you first. He smiled into the dark. Outside, Ayana paused, laying her palm against the lodge wall where his head would be. She stood like that for 3 breaths, and then walked away to her own bed. The river went on talking. The night, glad for good work done well, folded the camp into itself like a shawl, and hummed a song so old no one hears it with their ears any more, and yet everyone sleeps better when it is sung. Morning would come again too soon, and just in time. Poles would be cut, direction names learned, smoke would carry praise. Harrison would ride for truth with men whose hands had been shifted a little toward gentleness by what they had seen. There would be a day to cross, and then a dusk, and then the moon would turn and turn again, until vows could become a house with 2 doors and the same hearth. For now, breath moved in and out. Healing soft as moss found the places that had been split, and 2 names, Thomas and Ayana, lay down beside each other in the great book the sky keeps, written in ink the color of dawn. Morning folded itself into the camp with the pale gold of a new page. Thomas woke to the smell of cedar and warm earth, the soft rasp of a broom of willow twigs sweeping a doorway, the thin laugh of a child who had discovered something small and perfect, like a beetle jewel-bright under a stone. His back ached with a steady, livable fire, the kind that could be talked down by kindness, and for a long breath he lay still, listening to how this place breathed. It was not the barked cadence of a bugle or the iron clatter of boots on plank. It was a low, generous hum. It felt like being sung to, even in silence. Outside, the river kept its patient counsel. Ayana's voice, quiet, sure, braided itself with an older woman's as they traded words the way women trade good needles, with care and a bit of teasing. Thomas rose and dressed slowly, the beads at his chest chilling, then warming against skin, a small promise with every breath. He stepped into the light, and the day accepted him without flinch, the way a meadow accepts a new shadow, making room, keeping shape. Ayana crossed to him with a bowl of porridge that steamed in the cool. She had tucked thin slices of dried berry into it, and the sweetness found his tongue like a soft answer. She watched him taste the first spoonful, curious, hopeful, a little proud, and when his face opened in pleased surprise, her shoulders loosened in that quiet, private way that made his heart knock at his ribs. She touched the beaded strip at his wrist, as if to check that last night hadn't been a story only the dark believed. Then she said a word, slow and clear, showing him where it sat in her mouth. "Wallfiller," she said. "Gratitude." He tried it. His tongue stumbled. She laughed. He laughed. And the laughter knit something new and strong between them that neither fear nor pain could lift. They worked. The men walked the low hills for poles, and Thomas went with them, learning how to read a tree's answer before the blade asked its question. Iron Bear showed him where the grain spoke with the wind and how to set the knife so wood became ribbon, not splinter. The tools fit his hands like long-awaited brothers. Each curl that fell to the ground smelled of sun-trapped years released, and Thomas felt himself straighten inside as he learned the motion that made the knife sing. When his back protested, he rested as if obeying an elder, not betraying a task. Each pause became a lesson, not a failure. Ayana and the women measured hides against pole lengths in a geometry of memory and touch. She called him once, and together they held a length of skin between them, its weight a comfortable pull, like a future tugging you by both hands. She gave him another word. "Tioshpaye," she said softly. "Family." He repeated it, careful, reverent. The words settled into him like a warm stone. At midday, a pot was set in the shade, and the circle of eating formed, without anyone telling anyone else to sit. Bread passed from hand to hand. Meat broke along the lines it wanted to. Talk flowed around Thomas and touched him with soft hands, not grabbing, just including. The first shy child from yesterday stood at his knee with a question that took the shape of showing him a string puzzle. Thomas let the boy place the string on his fingers, and soon his hands cradled a small cat's cradle that made Ayana grin. Their eyes met above the net of string, and for a heartbeat he felt time go sweetly thin. One of those small doorways life opens and closes without spectacle, the kind that lets breath become prayer. Harrison rode out that afternoon with 20 men and 2 of Iron Bear's scouts, whose faces gave away nothing but attention. The colonel raised 2 fingers in farewell. Thomas answered with the smallest lift of his hand, a gesture that felt like laying down for good, an invisible pack he had carried too long. Dust trailed the patrol, a veil that thinned as the day pushed on. When the sound of hooves curled away into distance, the camp's music resumed its soft, relentless making, shoeing a horse, sewing a seam, scolding a boy who had tried to see how high chili will climb into a nose. Ayana set her palm at the small of Thomas's back and guided him to the river path when the heat mellowed. They walked through willow shade, dappling them in broken coins of light, and she taught him the names of the directions in a sequence that made sense to the skin. The way smoke rises, the way water runs, the way wind slips over grass at sundown. He said each one until the consonants sat right in his throat, until the vowels stopped tasting like strangers. When he faltered, she slowed. When he blushed, she smiled. When he got a sound clean, she touched his shoulder with proud tenderness that burned brighter than any medal he had ever imagined. Near the bend where the river licked a smooth bank, they practiced silence. She showed him how to hear the difference between a hawk's cry and the startled call of a rabbit, how the river says, "Shallow here, careful there," how the cottonwoods speak in leaves about weather that has not happened yet. He learned how to put his hands on his knees when he crouched, the way men here did, to keep mud off his trousers and pride off his face. He learned that listening is a kind of love, and that he had been loud inside for years without knowing. Later they raised poles, men and women and older children tipping the long ribs of a future house into place, while Iron Bear's voice counted in a rhythm older than the fort's walls. Thomas stood inside the circle while the last pole was set, and Ayana's braid brushed his forearm in the moment the frame found itself and stood tall. For one dizzy breath the whole world seemed to lock into meaning, a wheel catching the right notch. He could see it, the hide tightened, the door flap beaded, the insides smelling of smoke and sage, the soft slope of their bedding, the fine dust that would always settle and always be swept. The picture came with a calm so deep it almost knocked him from his feet. After work, he washed. The rope marks were purple now, yellowing at the edges. The lashes were glossy with salve and stubborn in their anger. He found a mirror of polished metal near the women's shelter and caught sight of his own back for the first time since the post. Shame rose, the quick, hot kind, born not of guilt, but of the fear that your wounds are too large for welcome. He stood very still and let the shame swell so that it could ebb. Then he felt a presence behind him and knew without turning that it was Ayana. She did not say hush or don't be foolish. She did not offer a softness his pride would refuse. She lifted the mirror out of his hand so the image disappeared and set it gently aside. Then she ran her finger, not over the lines but just next to them, outlining without touching, naming without claiming. "This is the place your body remembers," she said. "It is not the place I love you from." The words undid him in the gentle way of linen being pulled from a line into warm hands. Breath left him and returned. He reached back and found her wrist and felt the beads she wore brush his skin with their small, bright courage. The river spoke. The light drew thin as bees' wings. A flock of birds turned over the meadow in one mind and then fell apart into 100 separate flights, each right, each beautiful. They stood like that, ordinary and holy, until his shame finished its speaking and sat down. At dusk, Iron Bear sent for him. The chief stood with a small bundle at the fire's edge, the pipe laid nearby like a sleeping thing. "Sage for your back," he said, opening the bundle to release a scent that was half sky, half earth. He showed Thomas how to crush it in his palm and warm it over coals until the oils released, then how to pass the smoke with kindness along the skin without scorching. "You ask the ache to leave," Iron Bear said, "the way you would ask a guest to go when it is late and they have stayed long enough, with respect, with humor, with your door already open." Thomas smiled into the rising smoke. He had never been taught to treat pain like a friend. He could walk to the gate. He listened to the old man's voice and learned. When the ache softened, as if truly persuaded, the chief nodded once, satisfied, and said, "Good." The evening's meal was thick stew again and bread again, and yet somehow both were new, flavoured by the day's work. The circle broke and reformed around small conversations. A young mother nursed her baby and told a story with her free hand. An uncle showed a boy how to plait rope and how not to lie about a knot. Two girls compared bead colours with the intensity of generals. Thomas sat with Ayana and Iron Bear and tried a new word. "Woyute," he said, tapping the bowl. "Food." "Woyute," Ayana echoed, pleased. "And this?" She pinched a bit between fingers, held it up. "Bread," he said, then flushed. She shook her head and gave him the sound. He tried again and got closer, then closer, and when he finally found it clean and right, she rewarded him with that quick, bright smile that moved through him like a small bell rung inside a well. Later, an elder asked Thomas for a story of his own. He flinched from anything that smelled of boasting, so he chose something humble. The winter morning a horse had found its way to his tent and nudged him awake because the animal had gotten its head stuck in a slack rope. He told it badly at first, then better, and when the circle laughed, it was with affection that widened into belonging. The old women traded glances that said, "Yes, there, that one knows how to tell on himself without shame." He took the measure of their approval like a coat set on his shoulders without fuss. Night came with its shawl. Stars took their places, patient as elders. The women sang a small, drowsy song to send the children toward bedding, and the men answered with a low line that turned the dark into a room with a roof. Thomas walked Ayana as far as the edge of her shelter, the cavern's soft light spilling there, voices inside plucking at thread, at story. He did not touch her mouth with his. That would be later, and it would be blessed. He pressed his forehead to hers for a breath, then another, and in that nearness he felt how gentle the world can be when two people do not rush its goodness. "Sleep," she whispered. "Tell your bones it is safe." He went to the aunt's lodge and did as he was told. Sleep came without argument, carrying dreams that did not wound. A room made of hide that breathed with the wind, a child's small hand sure in his own, the carved bird warm against his chest, as if it were a live thing settling closer to his heart. When he woke, the dreams did not vanish. They waited at the edge of day like polite guests who would come in when called. 2 more days opened and closed, then a third, and each one layered new steadiness over the first. Poles carried, words learned, a pony coaxed with apple and praise, a boy consoled without scolding when the string puzzle knotted itself into a snarl. Thomas's back changed colour, the furrows healing in quiet, honest work. The rope marks faded beneath Ayana's beads, the mirror remained untouched, and yet he held his body with more ease than any reflection could have taught him. If he was a storm, as the elder had said, he was the kind that leaves water. On the 4th evening, a smudge of dust appeared far off, small as a thumbprint on the horizon. Heads turned the way prairie grass turns to a wind it trusts and distrusts both. Iron Bear stood. Men rose easily, not in fear, in readiness. The smudge lengthened, sharpened to riders. Harrison's patrol returning before sunset. their pace measured, not rushed, and that told a story all its own. They had found something, and it had not crushed them. Thomas felt the old rhythm beat once in his chest, the drum of news, of consequence, of the larger world setting its shadow along the edge of this warm one. Ayana's fingers found his, and he laced his through hers, not tighter, just true. The beads at his chest gave a soft, sure sound. The riders neared, voices lifted. The river spoke on, calm as a witness. Whatever the patrol carried would soon be poured into the circle. Whatever truth arrived would test and then teach. But even as dust drew its veil over the meadow, the warmth of the day did not leave. The camp stood as it had learned to stand, in love, in work, in the good stubbornness of people who have decided that gentleness is not the opposite of strength, but the proof of it. And Thomas, standing in the seam between the two worlds, felt no tearing now, only a widening, a making of room. He took a slow breath, the kind the river had taught him. Ayana's shoulder brushed his. Iron Bear's silhouette steadied the horizon. Harrison's hat caught the last of the sun. The bells at his chest whispered their small courage. The riders reached the edge of camp, and the day, which had been a long kindness, turned its face toward the night, ready to listen. The riders broke through the haze of dusk, their silhouettes long against the meadow's fading gold. Colonel Harrison rode at the front, his coat streaked with dust, his hat drawn low, but his eyes, when they lifted, were not the eyes of a man returning with only war in his hands. Behind him, the scouts of Iron Bear moved with quiet composure, their faces unreadable, yet in their stillness was the weight of truth. The camp gathered without command, as if the earth itself had whispered for them to stand. Children were hushed by their mothers, elders folded their arms and fixed their eyes on the horizon, and Ayana's hand found Thomas's, her fingers resting with a calm that made the moment feel less like dread and more like breath waiting for its word. The horses slowed to a walk, then stopped in a circle of light thrown by the fires. Harrison dismounted, his movements heavy with miles and thought. He stood there for a moment, letting silence wrap him, his boots powdered with the same dust that coated the faces of his men. Then he raised his gaze to Iron Bear. For a breath, neither spoke. The air stretched, taut with the weight of everything at stake. Blood, peace, futures not yet born. The river murmured nearby, steady, as if to remind them that time itself could be a healer if men chose to let it. "It wasn't you," Harrison said at last, his voice cutting the silence clean. "The fires, the wagons, the graves, they weren't Lakota work. The signs were wrong. Different tracks, different blades. Someone wanted blame to wear a familiar face." He paused, the weariness of honesty deepening his words. They wanted war to come easy. The breath that moved through the camp was like wind through tall grass, a ripple of relief, of sorrow, of confirmation that the world was still bent, but not yet broken. Iron Bear's jaw set in that quiet way of men who have seen too many tricks laid against their people. He nodded once, grave and unsurprised. "Truth always leaves its shadow," he said. "I am glad you brought it back instead of a lie." Harrison's gaze drifted to Thomas then, to the beads bright against his chest, to the scars that told their own scripture. Something softened in his face, something almost fatherly. "I've got a report to write," he said, "and 1,000 voices who will try to tell me I should have brought you back in chains. But I saw what I saw. A man stood where shame was and turned it away. That's a story I can live with." Thomas felt the words land inside him like a balm, like cool water poured over heated skin. He had stood at the edge of duty and love, and chosen what his bones had whispered was right. And here, finally, was a voice that did not call that choice weakness. Ayana's fingers pressed against his, grounding him, a silent echo of all she had said and all she would say. He looked at her and saw not only the woman he loved, but the future she carried, the campfires, the children, the lives made whole through patience and courage. The scouts slipped away into the dark, silent as shadow, to carry word of the night to those who needed to hear it. The soldiers rested their horses, their eyes lingering on the camp's circle of fire, and in their silence was something unfamiliar to Thomas. Respect. The world felt fragile but possible, the kind of fragile that invites careful hands, the kind that makes men softer when they remember it is not theirs to break. Iron Bear stepped closer to Harrison, and the two men, enemies by paper, stood within arm's reach. The old chief placed his hand briefly against his chest, then let it fall. "Your people will not remember peace if no one tells them its face," he said. "Tell it, even if they laugh. Even if they call you weak, tell them you saw two fires share smoke." Harrison exhaled, long and slow, then nodded. "I will." The night deepened. Children were gathered to their blankets. Women drew shawls around their shoulders. Men set new wood to the fire so its light would last until morning. In that glow, Thomas turned to Ayana, her eyes luminous with reflection of flame, her face a harmony of strength and tenderness. She reached into her pouch and drew the carved bird once more, holding it between them. "This was the first promise," she whispered. "Now we make more. Not with beads, not with smoke, with days, with years." He touched the bird, felt the warmth of her hand behind it, and understood that vows were not sealed only in ceremony, but in every sunrise, in every choice to keep walking together when the world grew difficult. He bent his head, his forehead resting against hers, the firelight flickering in the space between. Around them, the camp breathed like one living body, and above them the stars bore witness, patient and eternal. The healing was not finished. It might never be finished. But it was real, and it was theirs. In scars and smoke, in laughter and quiet words, in bread shared and burdens carried, love had taken root in the soil of two worlds. Thomas felt it in his chest, steady and unyielding. He belonged, not because blood or law declared it, but because love had chosen him, and he had chosen love back. The fire cracked, sending a stream of sparks upward like prayers. Children murmured into sleep, warriors softened their vigilance, elders leaned closer to listen to the night. Thomas squeezed Ayana's hand, and she answered with a smile that was both new and ancient. Tomorrow would bring more work, more trials, more watching eyes. But tonight they had made something indestructible. Tonight, peace had a face. And as you sit here listening, dear heart, let this story remind you that love is not weakness. It is the strongest thread, weaving healing where the world tries to tear. If these words touched you, if they made your spirit rest softer, let your thoughts join the circle too. Leave a comment, share your feelings, Press like so this fire can glow brighter, and subscribe so more hearts can gather here beside the warmth. In your presence, the story lives on, and together we keep the promise that love always finds its way